The final click of the heavy oak door was a sound no louder than a snapping twig, yet it carried the weight of a felled tree. It was the sound of a life being severed. Saul stood on the dusty boards of the town hall porch, a small cloth sack in one hand containing a spare shirt, a whetstone, and a tin of coffee. In his other hand, a folded paper that was once the deed to his land, now just a useless document confirming his exile. The mayor's words still hung in the air, thick and cloying like summer dust. "It's a generous offer, Saul. The quarry pays. It's honest, hard work. Better than holding on to pride until you starved." The arithmetic of it was simple, brutal. His plot of land, made worthless by the new water rights declaration, against the mayor's offer of indentured labor. He had refused. The door had clicked shut. He looked down at the coins in his palm, a small, sad weight of silver and copper. It was the sum of his savings, the careful accumulation of years, now reduced to a pittance that could not buy back a single day of his past life. He could feel the eyes of the town on him as he stepped off the porch. They peered from behind curtains, from the shaded doorways of the saloon and the mercantile. Their looks were a mixture of pity and a certain grim satisfaction, the kind people feel when a difficult problem is finally removed from their sight. He was no longer a neighbor, he was a cautionary tale. He walked past the small lot where he and his wife, Martha, had once coaxed a small kitchen garden from the stubborn soil. He remembered the feel of her hand in his as they planted beans, the shared silence of their work a conversation in itself. Now, it was just a patch of weeds, already being reclaimed by the wilderness at the edge of town. The memory was a physical ache, a pressure behind his ribs that made the simple act of breathing a conscious effort. He was utterly, completely alone. The town had shrunk around him, its familiar streets now a hostile landscape. Every corner held a ghost, every doorway a judgment. His destination was not the quarry, but somewhere beyond the town's suffocating consensus, somewhere the mayor's charity and the town's pity could not reach. He pushed open the door to Finch's Mercantile, a bell announcing his entry with a cheerful, inappropriate jangle. The air inside was a dense tapestry of smells: leather, salt pork, kerosene, and dry goods. Finch stood behind the counter, polishing a set of scales with a soft cloth, his movements precise and unhurried. He looked up, his expression shifting from neutral business to a carefully managed sympathy. "Saul. I heard what happened." The words were quiet, but they filled the small store. Finch was the town's central nerve, nothing happened that he didn't know within the hour. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "There's a cot in the back room. You could help me with stock, sweep up. We can work something out. There's no shame in taking a hand when you're down." It was another sensible offer, another cage lined with the straw of public approval. Saul felt the walls of the store closing in, the neatly stacked cans and barrels a monument to a life of safe, predictable transactions he could no longer afford. He shook his head, the movement small but definite. He walked past the barrels of crackers and flour, his eye scanning the shelves not for sustenance, but for tools. He ran his hand over the smooth, fire-hardened hickory of a shovel handle. He tested the heft of a pickaxe, its steel head gleaming dully in the filtered light. He selected a heavy-bladed hoe, a ball of thick twine, 2 large canvas tarps, and a handful of heavy iron hooks. At the counter, he laid out his selections. Finch raised an eyebrow, his gaze moving from the tools to Saul's face. "This is a strange shopping list for a man with no land. What are you planning to build out there in the canyon, a monument to stubbornness?" Saul didn't answer immediately. He opened a small wooden box on the counter, filled with seed packets. He chose carefully: potatoes, carrots, hardy winter greens, beans that thrived in poor soil. He added them to the pile. "Just what I need," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. He pushed his small stack of coins across the polished wood. Finch counted it out, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. He pushed a few copper coins back. "You're a fool, Saul. But you're an honest fool. The winter will break you." The shopkeeper's words were not meant to be cruel, but they were a verdict all the same. Saul picked up the last of his money and pocketed it. He bundled the tools and supplies, the weight of them a strange comfort. It was the weight of a future, however uncertain. It was the price of refusing to be broken. The journey away from the town was a deliberate stripping away of all that was familiar. He did not look back. The sun was a hammer in a brassy sky, and the path he took was not a path at all, but the dry, cracked bed of a river that had not seen a proper flow in a generation. The land here was hostile, a place of sharp rocks and thorny scrub, where the only shade was fleeting and treacherous. With every step, the sounds of the town, the distant clang of the blacksmith, the faint shouts of children, faded, replaced by the crunch of his own boots on loose stone and the whisper of a hot, dry wind. He walked for hours, the weight of the tools on his shoulder a constant, grounding pressure. This was his penance and his liberation. The heat baked the grief and anger out of him, leaving only a core of hard, unyielding purpose. The land was an empty canvas, and he was walking himself out of the frame of his old life. By late afternoon, he saw it. The Great Stone Bridge. It was a relic of an older time, a massive twin-arched span of granite that crossed the deepest part of the canyon. It was built for a trade route that had long since been abandoned, and now it stood as a monument to forgotten ambitions. The locals considered it a place of bad luck, a tombstone in the wilderness. To Saul, it looked like a promise. He left the riverbed and began the careful descent down the steep canyon wall, using handholds in the rock, his tools clattering softly against his back. As he got lower, the air changed. The oppressive heat of the sun vanished, replaced by a profound, cellar-like cool. He finally stood on the canyon floor, directly beneath the colossal structure. The scale of it was immense. The two great stone abutments were rooted deep in the earth, and the arches soared high above him, a man-made sky of grey stone. It was silent here, a deep, resonant quiet that absorbed all sound. The world outside had disappeared. He walked into the deep shade, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. He ran a hand over the cool, rough-hewn surface of a pier. It felt ancient, solid, a foundation that had withstood a century of sun and storm. And then he heard it. A sound so small it was almost imperceptible. Drip. 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 He followed the sound to the far canyon wall, where the bridge's foundation met the natural rock. There, from a hairline fissure in the stone, a single drop of water emerged, glistened for a moment, and fell. It was followed by another, and another. A slow, steady, life-giving pulse, hidden in the heart of the stone. It was a secret spring, a hidden asset in this forsaken place. He knelt and touched the damp soil beneath the seep. It was cool and dark. Here, in the tomb, was a womb. The first task was to fight the ground itself. The canyon floor under the bridge was not soil but a pavement of fallen rock and compacted scree, hardened by time and pressure. Saul took up the pickaxe, its weight familiar and purposeful in his hands. The first strike sent a jarring shock up his arms, and the clang of steel on stone echoed in the vast, quiet space. It was a sound of defiance. For days, that was the only sound. The rhythmic ring of the pick, the scrape of the shovel, the grating slide of rock being moved. He worked from the first hint of angled morning light until the deep shadows of evening swallowed what little illumination reached the canyon floor. His body, soft from his last few months of grieving inaction, screamed in protest. His hands blistered, then bled, then hardened into calluses. The labor was a crucible. It burned away the lingering traces of self-pity, leaving only the sharp, clean focus of the immediate task. Each rock he pried from the earth was a small victory. He was not merely clearing land, he was dismantling the impossibility of the place. He began to see a pattern in the chaos. He used the larger, flatter stones he excavated to build low, sturdy retaining walls. He wasn't imposing a shape on the land so much as collaborating with it, following the natural contours of the ground beneath the arches. Slowly, painstakingly, 3 long, terraced beds began to take form. They were ugly, functional things, walls of rough stone holding back the earth he was liberating. And the earth itself was another discovery. Beneath the top layer of rock and gravel was a deep, rich deposit of silt, washed down from the plains above over countless seasons of rain. It was dark, loamy, and cool to the touch. It smelled of deep time and slow growth. He spent a week just turning it over with the shovel, breaking up the clumps, feeling its texture, assessing its potential. He worked with a methodical intensity, his world shrinking to the few hundred square feet of his chosen sanctuary. The pain in his muscles became a familiar companion, a reminder that he was still alive, still capable of shaping his own world. He was transforming this barren patch of ground, and in doing so, the ground was transforming him. He was no longer Saul the widower, Saul the outcast. He was a man building something from nothing, with nothing but his own 2 hands and a core of unshakable will. With the earth prepared, he turned his attention to the 2 other essential elements, water and light. The steady drip from the rock seep was his only source of water, a precious, finite resource that could not be wasted. He spent 2 full days studying it, watching the slow rhythm of its fall, measuring the small pool of moisture it created. He needed to capture it, store it, and direct it. He took up his pickaxe again, but this time his work was delicate. He carefully chipped away at the rock face around the seep, not to force it, but to gently persuade the water to follow a new path. He created a small, shallow channel, a tiny man-made tributary. He then used flat shards of slate he found in the riverbed, wedging them into the rock and sealing the edges with a mixture of clay and silt, extending the channel. It was slow, frustrating work. A poorly placed stone could divert the entire flow, wasting hours of effort. But he learned the logic of the water, its patient insistence, its tendency to seek the lowest point. He followed its lead. At the end of the channel, he dug a cistern, a deep basin about the size of a large barrel. He lined it meticulously with the densest clay he could find, packing it down with his hands and feet until the walls were smooth and impermeable. It took another day for the first trickle to reach the basin, and another week for it to fill. Every morning, he would check the water level, a silent ritual of accounting. It was his system, his lifeblood, a closed loop of capture and preservation. Light was a more complex problem. The massive stone arches provided a perfect shield from the searing sun and harsh weather, but they also cast the garden in perpetual twilight. He became an astronomer of his small, sheltered world. He spent a day just watching, marking the ground with stones to track the slow, creeping path of the sunlight that angled in from the east in the morning and the west in the afternoon. The direct light lasted barely an hour on any given bed. It wasn't enough. He unrolled one of the canvas tarps. Using the iron hooks and his heavy twine, he began to experiment. He secured one end of the tarp high on the canyon wall, angling it down, trying to catch the morning sun and reflect its pale, diffuse light onto the first terrace. It was a clumsy, imperfect system. The angle had to be just right, the canvas pulled taut. But it worked. He could see the brightness on the soil increase, a subtle but significant shift. He built a second reflector for the afternoon sun. His garden now operated on borrowed light, a system of mirrors made of canvas and hope. With the systems of earth, water, and light in place, he finally allowed himself to plant. He pushed the potato eyes deep into the rich silt, laid the carrot seeds in neat rows, and sowed the hardy greens in the shadiest sections. The act of placing each seed in the ground was a final, irrevocable commitment. He was no longer just building, he was growing. The first sign of life was almost violent in its beauty. A single, pale green shoot pushing its way through the dark soil. It was a potato plant, insistent and alive. Soon it was joined by another, and then a whole row of them, their leaves unfurling in the reflected light. The carrot sent up feathery green tops, and the kale began to form its first rugged leaves. In the grey, silent world under the bridge, this explosion of green felt like a shout. It was a private, profound victory that needed no audience. But an audience found him. A rider, a young man from the eastern village, stopped on the bridge above to rest his horse. He glanced over the stone parapet, likely out of sheer boredom, and saw movement below. He saw a man, gaunt and sun-weathered, tending to neat rows of impossible green. The story he told when he reached town was garbled, a strange tale of a ghost in the canyon growing a phantom garden. The rumor mill began to grind. Saul became a local legend, a figure of pity and ridicule. They called him the bridge hermit, that canyon ghost children would dare each other to run across the bridge, whispering that Saul would catch them and plant them in his rock garden. The talk was a distant noise, like the buzz of flies, something he was aware of but could easily ignore. Then Finch came. The shopkeeper made the long walk from town, carrying a basket. He found Saul on his knees, carefully thinning a row of young carrots. Finch stood at the edge of the cultivated ground, his town shoes looking absurdly out of place. "Saul," he said, his voice softer than Saul remembered. "The town is worried. They say you're losing your mind out here." He held out the basket. Inside was a loaf of stale bread, a chunk of hard cheese, and a piece of dried jerky. It was a gesture of charity, an offering to a madman. "This is folly," Finch said, his gaze sweeping over the terraces, the canvas reflectors, the clay-lined cistern. "You can't grow a real crop here. The first good frost will wipe this all out. Come back. I still have that spot for you." Saul stood up, wiping the soil from his hands onto his trousers. He didn't look at the basket. He walked over to a thriving potato plant and dug his hands into the loose earth around its base. He pulled gently, and the soil gave way, revealing a cluster of small, perfectly formed new potatoes, their skins pale and thin. He held one up. It was solid, real, heavy in his palm. "I'm fine, Finch," he said. "But thank you for the walk." The shopkeeper stared at the potato, then at Saul's face, searching for some sign of the madness he'd expected to find. He saw only a quiet, weary resolve. Finch left the basket on a rock and walked away without another word. Saul did not touch the charity. The food he ate would be his own. Autumn arrived not as a gentle transition but as a sudden, sharp clarity in the air. The heat of summer broke, and the nights grew teeth. From his sanctuary, Saul could see the foliage on the canyon rim shift from green to a brief, fiery burst of yellow and orange before fading to brown. The angle of the sun grew lower, and his canvas reflectors required daily adjustment to catch the diminishing light. The ridicule from the town changed its tune. The morbid curiosity of summer, of watching a man attempt the impossible, was replaced by a grim, knowing certainty. They were no longer waiting for him to fail, they were waiting for him to freeze. He was a fool who had traded a roof for a pile of rocks, and winter was the great arbiter of such foolishness. But Saul was not idle. He was preparing. He had spent the late summer and early autumn in a state of constant, methodical labor. The harvest was his first priority. He dug up the potatoes, hundreds of pounds of them, their sizes varying but their substance undeniable. He pulled the carrots, long and straight from the loose silt. He carefully harvested the beans, drying them on a torp in the slivers of direct sun. He constructed a root cellar, digging horizontally into the dense clay of the canyon wall, creating a small, dark cavern. He lined it with flat stones and built a heavy, insulated door from scavenged planks and packed earth. The temperature inside remained stable, cool and dry, a perfect vault for his root vegetables. For the hardiest greens, the kale and chard that could withstand a frost, he built cold frames. He used bent willow branches scavenged from further down the riverbed to create low, arched skeletons over the beds, and stretched his second canvas torp over them at night, creating miniature greenhouses. His greatest asset, however, was the bridge itself. He had come to understand its true nature. The immense mass of stone was a thermal battery. All day, it soaked up whatever ambient warmth the sun provided, and all night, it slowly, steadily radiated that warmth back into the sheltered space beneath it. This created a microclimate, a buffer zone that was always several degrees warmer than the exposed land outside. The stone was his furnace, his shield, his collaborator. The first snow arrived as a flurry of fine, white powder. It dusted the canyon rim, a stark white line against the gray sky. Within a day, a heavier storm followed, blanketing the entire landscape. The world outside his sanctuary was transformed into a place of stark, monochrome silence. But under the bridge, his small patch of protected green remained. The contrast was absolute. Outside, a world of entropy and cold. Inside, a system of order and preserved life. He had built not just a garden, but an engine for survival. The real storm arrived without warning. It began as a heavy snow, but then the wind rose to a piercing shriek, driving the flakes horizontally, erasing the world in a churning vortex of white. The blizzard was a living thing, a predator that consumed the landscape. It howled over the top of the bridge, the sound a deep, resonant moan in the stone above him. For 3 days, it did not stop. For a week, the sky remained a uniform, oppressive grey, dumping foot after foot of snow. The villages in the region, connected by little more than dirt tracks and optimistic trails, were completely isolated. They became islands in a sea of white, their carefully calculated winter stores suddenly seeming meager and insufficient. Panic was a quiet, creeping thing, a cold that seeped under doors and into hearts. The mayor's centralized food store in the main town, meant to last until the spring thaw, was already being rationed at a starvation level. In this frozen, desperate world, the story of the madman under the bridge was forgotten. Then came the intrusion. Saul was checking the seal on his root cellar door when he heard a sound that did not belong, a weak, rhythmic scraping from the mouth of his sheltered space. He moved toward it, cautious, and found a figure collapsed in the snow, a young man, barely more than a boy, his face blue with cold. He was scrabbling weakly at the snowdrift that blocked the entrance, his movements feeble and uncoordinated. He was the crisis catalyst, the outside world breaching the walls of Saul's carefully constructed life. Saul dragged him inside, away from the wind's bite. The young man was light, his body ravaged by cold and hunger. Inside the small alcove where Saul slept, a tiny, efficient brazier glowed with a handful of precious charcoal. Saul wrapped the stranger in his own blankets, forcing warm, sweetened coffee between his chattering teeth. Slowly, color returned to the boy's face. His shivering subsided. Saul ladled a thick, hot soup into a bowl, a stew of potatoes, carrots, and dried beans from his stores. The young man drank it greedily, the first real food he'd had in days. It was here that the moral arithmetic presented itself. Saul had enough food to last him through the winter, perhaps even 2 if he was careful. This stranger represented a drain on that system. Every bowl of soup he served was a meal he would not have for himself. But the calculation was simple. You do not let a man die when you have the means to save him. It was a principle as solid and unyielding as the stone arch above his head. He had built this place to sustain life, and life had arrived, asking for sustenance. When the young man, whose name was Thomas, was finally able to speak, his story came out in a torrent of desperate words. He was from the eastern village. Their stores were gone. The blizzard had caught them with their hunting parties out, their supply lines cut. They were eating boiled leather and seed grain. He had been sent to try and reach the main town for help, a hopeless mission that had nearly cost him his life. His eyes, wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief, scanned the impossible sight around him, the neat rows of kale under their canvas covers, the sturdy door of the root cellar, the general sense of order and abundance in a world that had been reduced to freezing chaos. "How," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "How is any of this here?" Saul did not offer a long explanation. He simply opened the root cellar door. The sight of the bins, overflowing with potatoes and carrots, the strings of dried beans hanging from the ceiling, made Thomas weep silently. The rescue began not with a grand plan, but with the simple act of filling a sack. Saul owned a small, sturdy handsled, built for hauling rocks. Now, he loaded it with sacks of potatoes, carrots, and bundles of preserved greens. He knew the terrain as no one else did. The blizzard had buried the roads, but the canyon floor, protected from the worst of the wind and drifts, offered a treacherous but passable route. He set out with Thomas, not as a savior, but as a man with a sled full of vegetables. The journey was brutal. The cold was a physical entity that sought to steal the heat from their bodies. They navigated by the shape of the canyon walls, following the frozen, snow-dusted trickle of the riverbed. When they finally arrived at the eastern village, they were met with stunned silence. The villagers, gaunt and hollow-eyed, stared at the sacks of food as if they were a miracle. The revelation was not in words, but in the earthy smell of potatoes, the bright orange of carrots. Food. Real food. After leaving enough to sustain them, Saul pushed on, Thomas now a willing and strong partner. They made the journey to the next village, and then the next, delivering life from the back of a simple sled. Finally, they turned toward the main town, his old home. As they emerged from the canyon, dragging the last of their cargo, they were seen. The mayor and Finch were standing at the edge of town, overseeing a group of men attempting to clear a path. They stopped, mouths agape, as the canyon ghost walked out of the frozen wilderness, pulling a sled laden with fresh food. The tomb had become an ark. The fool had become their only hope. The distribution of the food was a quiet, orderly affair. There were no grand speeches, no proclamations. Saul simply unloaded the sacks in the center of the town square, his movements as methodical as they had been when he was building his stone walls. The townspeople, their faces pinched with hunger and cold, formed a line. The mayor, his face a mask of conflicted emotions, stepped forward. "Saul," he began, his voice uncertain. We didn't know." Saul looked at him, his gaze level, and said nothing. His silence was more powerful than any accusation. It was the simple, undeniable fact of the sacks at his feet that did the talking. The competence was the statement. Finch was the first to act. He pushed through the small crowd, not with a basket of charity, but with a ledger and a piece of chalk. "Let's be fair about this," he announced, his voice taking on its familiar mercantile authority. "A portion for every family. We'll weigh it out." He looked at Saul, a new respect in his eyes. "We'll pay you, of course. Town scrip. Good for anything in my store when the thaw comes." It was not an apology, but it was a transaction. It was an admission of value. Pity had been replaced by commerce, and in this hard land, commerce was the highest form of respect. The reversal was complete. The mayor, humbled, stood by and let Finch manage the process. He approached Saul once more, his posture no longer that of a confident leader but of a man forced to confront a profound error in judgment. "We misjudged the entire situation," he said, the words costing him a great deal. "And we misjudged you." Saul gave a slight nod. It was all the acknowledgement the mayor would get, and all he needed. He had not done this for their approval. He had done it because it was the work that needed to be done. As the last of the food was given out, a change occurred in the sky. A sliver of pale sun broke through the oppressive grey clouds. It was a weak, watery light, but it was a promise. The blizzard was breaking. The long siege of winter was ending. Saul turned and, without a word to anyone, began the long walk back to his canyon, his empty sled gliding easily behind him. He left behind a town that was no longer his home, but was now, in a strange way, his dependent. His reputation had been remade, not by words, but by the undeniable weight of a potato. The whispers of Canyon Ghost and Bridge Hermit were already being replaced by a new title, spoken with a sense of awe, the Bridge Gardener. The spring, when it finally came, was a slow, muddy affair. The great thaw turned the world to slush and mire, but under the bridge, the melt was controlled, the water seeping into the rich soil of the terraces. The surviving kale plants, which had endured under their canvas shields, sent up new, tender shoots. The world was coming back to life, and so was Saul's garden. He was no longer an outcast. He was a destination. The first visitor was Finch, who came not with charity but with a mule loaded with supplies. He brought sacks of flour, salt, coffee, and new tools, a fine steel spade, a sharpening file, a new lantern with a full can of oil. "Trade," Finch said simply, gesturing to the goods. "For what you'll grow this summer." It was the beginning of a new economy. Soon, others followed. A man from the eastern village brought cured hides, trading them for a promise of seed potatoes. A woman brought jars of preserved fruit, a luxury Saul had not tasted in a year. They came to trade, to ask for advice, to look with their own eyes at the place that had saved them. They no longer saw a tomb, they saw a miracle of engineering and persistence. Saul accepted the commerce, but he kept his distance. He was polite but reserved. He had built his world in solitude, and he was not eager to give it up. The quiet of the canyon, the rhythmic drip of the seep, the feel of the soil in his hands, this was his society now. He spent his days expanding his systems. He improved the cistern, deepening it and building a clever overflow channel to prevent flooding during the spring melt. He worked on a more elaborate light reflection system, using scavenged pieces of tin to create brighter, more focused beams of light for the sun-hungry plants he now planned to grow: tomatoes, peppers, squash. He was not just rebuilding, he was iterating, improving, strengthening the engine he had created. One afternoon, as he was reinforcing one of the terrace walls, the mayor appeared at the edge of his garden. He stood there for a long time, simply watching Saul work. The town council voted, the mayor said finally, his voice formal. "We are restoring your deed. The old water rights declaration has been amended." Saul placed a final stone into the wall, ensuring it was set perfectly. He stood and looked at the mayor, then at the town in the far distance. He could go back. He could reclaim his old life, his old name. He thought of the small, weed-choked plot of land, the judgmental eyes, the sensible cages people built for themselves. He looked at his green terraces, at the steady drip of water, at the massive, silent stones that were his roof and his walls. "Thank you," Saul said, his voice quiet but clear. "But I think I'll stay here." There's still work to be done. He turned back to his wall, picking up his trowel. The work was not a burden, it was his purpose. Here, under the bridge, he had found something more valuable than land or a name. He had found a hard-earned, unshakable peace.